Student friends, in yesterday's extra lecture, we studied the concept of pulse code modulation and pulse width modulation. In pulse code modulation, the general characteristics of pulse width is varied as far as amplitude of the sampled signal is being considered, and it is rounded off to achieve the particular quantization level. After quantization, it is coded into the binary form. That means analog signal is clamped by introducing the DC bias, and then its samples are taken at a different interval of times. After taking the samples are given to the quantization level for the rounding of purpose, and then they are encoded after compressing the signal to reduce the bandwidth and to improve the quality in the transmission, and in the receiver the same signal is expanded to convert it into the original form. This is what the meaning of pulse code modulation we studied. After that, we studied the concept of pulse width modulation. In this case, as amplitude of the signal changes, width of pulse is varied, either by increasing the trailing edge or by decreasing the trailing edge or by changing the both. Width of pulse is changed with the change in amplitude. So that is what we can call it as, it is pulse width modulation. Friends, today we are going to consider another two digital modulation methods, out of which one is pulse position modulation, that is PPM. It is the process in which, as amplitude of the sampled signal changes, the position of the pulse changes. Here width doesn't changes, but position of the pulse that changes as the amplitude of the signal that changes. This concept we can call it as, it is pulse position modulation. It is a process in which the position of the standard pulse is varied as a function of amplitude of sampled modulating signal. We already studied that analog signal is DC biased and clamped at the one of the side. Then its samples are taken at a different interval of the time. As sample taken at the different interval of time, as its amplitude changes, accordingly the position of the pulse that changes. So that is what we can call it as pulse position modulation. Assuming the center of each pulse occurs at 0, t, 2t, these are the time intervals of the samples. The modulating signal shifts the entire pulse by an amount delta t sine of omega mt. So this is the shift with delta t is the shift with which the position of the pulse that takes place, and that's why we can get the train of modulated pulses. PPM pulse train is obtained by producing pulse width modulation first, and then it is a feed to monostable multivibrator. Means pulse position modulation is obtained by using pulse width modulation first. As we have studied in yesterday's lecture, the PWM signal is given to the monostable multivibrator. We are aware with the monostable multivibrator. Also, we have studied this multivibrator in last year, paper number 6. Dear students, the input signal to be modulated is given to the PWM circuitry. PWM produces the variation of the width at the output. This signal is used to trigger the monostable multivibrator, and at the output we can get the train of shifted position of the pulses, to which we can call it as it is the pulse position modulated wave. Dear students, that's all about the pulse position modulation. Now we are going to see another type of digital modulation, and that is pulse amplitude modulation. It is the type of modulation in which, as amplitude of the sampled signal varies, the amplitude of pulse also varies. Meaning thereby, if the amplitude of the modulating signal changes, accordingly the amplitude of the amplitude of the pulse changes. That is called as pulse amplitude modulation. In the pulse amplitude modulation, amplitude of the pulse is varied in accordance with the instantaneous amplitude of the signal to be modulated, while width of the pulse is kept constant. Here width doesn't changes, but amplitude of the pulse changes as the amplitude of input signal changes. Thus, the area of these pulses becomes proportional to the instantaneous amplitude of the signal. So this is what it is here represented. So this is the signal to be modulated or message information. It is in the form of sinusoidal wave. These are the sampling pulses. These are used to take the sample of analog signal at a different interval of time. So this is the pulse used to take the sample at this amplitude. This is the pulse used to take the sample at this particular amplitude, and so on. At a different interval of time, the samples are taken by using the sampling pulses. And here is the pulse amplitude modulated signal. It is represented. Look at here. This is the pulse. Its amplitude changes. As the amplitude of the signal changes, there is change in amplitude. For this pulse, there is a rise in amplitude. For this pulse, there is a further rise in amplitude. For this pulse, there is a fall in amplitude. Fall in amplitude of signal, accordingly the amplitude of the signal that falls. And the same thing that repeats. So here it is clearly observed that as instantaneous amplitude of the signal to be modulated changes, accordingly the amplitude of the pulse that changes. So that's what we can call it as it is pulse amplitude modulation. The pulse amplitude modulation contains the USB and LSB frequency along with the modulating and pulse signal. Pulse amplitude modulator can be obtained by using the linear amplifier with modulating signal applied at its input and unmodulated pulse train in series with the signal. How it is obtained? It is obtained by using the linear amplifier, simply by using transistor as a linear amplifier. It is operated in the linear characteristic region along with having unmodulated pulse train and signal to be modulated. Both are applied to the linear amplifier circuitry in series with each other. Then the resulting output will be pulse amplitude modulated wave. When amplitude of pulse train and modulating signal is properly adjusted, the presence of pulse switch on the amplifier, and during this period amplified signal is obtained at the output. At the end of pulse, the amplifier is switched off and pulse amplitude modulated wave are produced. The pulse amplitude modulated waves are obtained by using the low pass filter with cutoff frequency equal to highest frequency of the modulating signal. This is represented in the diagram below. Look at here. This is the diagram actually. So this is a low pass filter. This is the information to be communicated in the form of sinusoidal form. It is filtered, high frequencies are attenuated, whereas lower frequencies are passed. It is given to the modulator, but simultaneously to the modulator, pulse generated output is given, means signal to be amplified, and pulses train is also given to the same circuitry. Depending upon this pulse width, it will turn on the modulating circuitry. And within its turn on period, whatever the input signal is passed, it is amplified. And it is made available at the output. But when turn on period of pulse is completed, naturally amplifier will turn off, or modulator circuit will be turned off, and no signal is available at the output. And again for the next pulse, it will trigger the modulator, it will turn on, and again the amplified signal appears at the output. So like that, pulse amplitude modulated signals are available at the output of modulator. This output is given to the pulse reshaping circuit. Pulse reshaping circuit means it is as like Smith trigger circuitry. It will reset the signal, and at the output, pulse amplitude modulated wave is available. Same circuitry is represented here. So this is the linear modulator. By using transistor, one can construct the amplifier. And this is the signal to be modulated, and this is the pulse carrier. So this is pulse. This one is, this information is here, this one, and this pulse is represented here, pulse carrier, and this is the modulator circuitry. Depends upon its width. At the positive edge, the device will be turned on. When the device will be turned on, the signal comes to the input, it is amplified, and it is made available at the output. This process will continue till the pulse width is going to be completing, means it goes to the trailing edge. When trailing edge comes to the input, naturally the transistor will be turned off, so that this signal is not available at the output. Means as its amplitude changes, accordingly the position of this particular carrier wave also changes, and that's why this is called as pulse amplitude type of modulation. Dear students, these are the types of digital modulation. Up till now, friends, we have studied analog modulation and also the digital modulation. In analog modulation, we studied amplitude modulation and frequency modulation. In digital modulation, we covered the amplitude shift keying, frequency shift keying, pulse code modulation, pulse width modulation, pulse position modulation, and pulse amplitude modulation. That forms almost all types of modulation process, including the analog modulation as well as the digital modulation. Students, that's all about the modulation, and do remember that this is the process that is used in transmitter to transmit the signal. As we are aware that modulation plays the very vital and important role to increase the speed of communication, to reduce the time of communication, to increase the distance of communication, to reduce the height of antenna, to reduce the design aspect of receiver, amplifier and transmitter. All these problems are solved only because of the modulation process that is being used in the transmitter. Friends, that's how the signal is transmitted from transmitting end. As because in first topic we studied that electronic communication is a process of transmitting, processing and receiving the signal from one point towards the another point. Accordingly, we studied half part, that is part of transmitter. Remaining part we are going to study as a part of receiver, and that's what we can call it as it is a demodulation. So that's what we can call it as it is a demodulation. Friends, demodulation we are going to study most probably in the next lecture. Today we'll stop here only.